He was counted out after losing sight in one eye. A brutal injury many thought would end his career became a defining moment of his life, but Michael Bisping refused to quit. Against all odds, he finessed his way through medical exams, adapted his fighting style to make up for his poor vision, and kept entering the octagon. Fights became life-threatening, and every win brought him closer to doing the impossible. Then, with just 2 weeks' notice, he entered the cage one more time and stunned the world, capturing the UFC Middleweight Championship.
Michael Bisping is the new UFC Middleweight Champion of the world!
This is the story of how Michael Bisping turned a devastating injury into a phenomenal legacy. Born on a British military base in Cyprus in 1979, Bisping spent his early years in England. His father, a British Army veteran, was a hard man with high standards, someone who knew what it meant to struggle and survive. That toughness rubbed off on Bisping, who grew up in a working-class environment, facing his fair share of challenges. From a young age, it was obvious that Bisping wasn't one to back down. His love for martial arts began at just 8 years old when he started training in Japanese jiu-jitsu. Inspired by action movies like Rocky, his father would drive him across the country to compete in tournaments, instilling the discipline and focus that would serve him for the rest of his life. Like many working-class kids, Bisping had to work hard to make ends meet. He tried everything: postman, plasterer, bricklayer, plumber, but nothing clicked. He briefly enrolled in an electrical engineering course, but dropped out after 3 months. It was a confusing time for him. Bisping had the potential to do more, but he felt stuck. That changed when he stumbled into kickboxing. In his teenage years, Bisping started competing in tough man contests like knockdown sport Budo, essentially bare-knuckle events before MMA had any real structure. These early fights were brutal, but they lit a fire in him. He knew fighting was what he was meant to do. It wasn't easy though. His family didn't have much money and he had to work multiple jobs to keep the lights on. He faced social stigma for his background and had issues with the law as a young man. Despite all this, Bisping never gave up. He turned every challenge into fuel, using martial arts not just as a hobby, but as an escape and a purpose. In 2003, he made a bold decision. He quit his job and committed to MMA full-time. At the time, MMA was a fringe sport in the UK with little money or recognition. It was a risky move, but Bisping believed in himself, and so did his girlfriend Rebecca, who encouraged him to follow his passion. His professional MMA debut came in 2004 at Pride and Glory 2, where he secured a win in just 38 seconds. By 2005, Bisping had become one of the biggest names in UK MMA. He captured titles in promotions like Cage Rage and Cage Warriors, racking up an undefeated record of 10 wins and 0 losses. He was no longer just another fighter, he was the face of British MMA, proving that fighters from the UK could hold their own. This early success laid the foundation for what would come next: a call to the Ultimate Fighter, a reality show that changed his life forever. Michael Bisping's journey in the UFC began in 2006, when he was featured on The Ultimate Fighter 3, training under Tito Ortiz. At the time, the UFC was still growing in popularity, and The Ultimate Fighter was a launching pad for future stars. Bisping made an immediate impression with his sharp wit, confidence, and relentless fighting style. Fans quickly took notice. In the season finale, Bisping TKO'd Josh Haynes, marking the beginning of a remarkable tenure in the UFC. Following his debut, Bisping racked up wins and established himself as a rising star, but the road to greatness was anything but smooth. His first major setback came in 2007 when he faced Rashad Evans. It was a closely contested fight that ended in a split decision loss, Bisping's first. For many fighters, a loss like that might derail their momentum, but for Bisping, it was just another lesson. In 2008, Bisping moved to the middleweight division. His first fight at middleweight was against Charles McCarthy, whom Bisping dominated and TKO'd. This transition to middleweight was the turning point of his career. With renewed focus and conditioning, Bisping carved a new path in the division, earning a reputation for his high-volume striking and relentless pressure. Then came UFC 100 in 2009, a fight that would become infamous. Bisping squared off against Dan Henderson, one of the most dangerous knockout artists in the sport. From the start, it was clear that Henderson was looking for the right moment to land his signature right hand. Unfortunately for Bisping, that moment came in the second round. Henderson delivered a thunderous overhand right that knocked Bisping out cold. To make matters worse, Henderson followed up with a second punch on the ground, a moment that became a staple of highlight reels for years.
That's all! He's down! And it is all over!
The loss was devastating. It wasn't just a setback in the rankings, it became one of the most replayed knockouts in MMA history. Again, for most fighters, a loss like that would be the beginning of the end. But Bisping is not like most fighters. He dusted himself off, went back to the gym, and began the slow, painful climb back to the top. He beat Dennis Kang a few months later, and the next few years were basically a hit or miss for him. He'd lose to guys like Wanderlei Silva and Chael Sonnen, but also defeat the likes of Dan Miller, Jorge Rivera, and Brian Stann. But then came the moment that defined Bisping's life and career. It was 2013, and Bisping was stepping into the octagon to face Vitor Belfort, a dangerous veteran known for his explosive power and devastating head kicks. For Bisping, this fight was supposed to be just another step on his relentless quest for a UFC title shot. What he didn't know was that this fight wouldn't just leave a mark on his record, it would nearly destroy his entire career. Midway through the fight, Vitor Belfort executed a perfectly timed head kick. Bisping didn't even see it coming. The impact was brutal. His vision blurred, colors faded, and soon after, his sight in his right eye was completely gone. The diagnosis? A detached retina. A serious injury that left him 100% blind in one eye. For most fighters, this would have been the end. Doctors told him he needed multiple surgeries, and even then, his vision might never return. Retirement seemed inevitable, but for Bisping, quitting was never an option. The road to recovery was brutal. Bisping underwent surgery after surgery, desperately hoping to repair the damage. But despite the doctor's best efforts, his right eye was beyond saving. The physical toll was hard, but the mental was even harder. He later said the mental side was by far the hardest part. Physically, you deal with it, but mentally, my entire identity had been taken away. He spiraled into depression. He turned to alcohol to cope with the dark days and overwhelming self-doubt. He felt lost, crushed, and unsure of what the future held. Most fighters would have hung up their gloves, but Bisping wasn't gonna just walk away without a fight. There was just one problem. If the UFC or athletic commissions found out he was blind in one eye, they'd ban him from competing. So Bisping did what he had to do. With the help of his coach, Jason Perillo, he developed a system to cheat the pre-fight medical exams. If a doctor covered his good eye and asked how many fingers they were holding up, Perillo would cough or yawn to signal the number. He later admitted, "I was lying my ass off." The fight itself was often the easiest part. The real challenge was passing the medicals and not getting pulled at the last second. Oddly enough, his crazy plan somehow worked. Bisping kept passing the test and stayed in the UFC, defying the odds every step of the way. It's not just the way he finessed medical tests either. To truly understand how unreal Bisping's journey was, you have to realize how important vision is in mixed martial arts. Depth perception, peripheral vision, balance, all of it matters. Losing sight in one eye makes that almost impossible. But Bisping refused to let that stop him. He rebuilt his fighting style from the ground up. No more wild swings and no more guessing. I throw punches at thin air, but once you connect, your brain kind of adjusts. It was tough, really tough, but eventually I got there. He focused on simple, high percentage strikes, especially his signature left hook. He leaned on constant pressure and movement, wearing opponents down with relentless volume. His footwork got sharper, his tactics smarter. He even added more kicks to control the distance and disrupt his opponent's rhythm. His blind spot on the right side was a weakness he couldn't ignore though. Attacks from that angle were harder to see, making him more vulnerable to strikes. But Bisping adapted. He kept moving, forcing opponents to fight his fight and never giving them time to exploit his weakness. While Bisping's body adjusted, it was his mental toughness that made the difference. Earlier in his career, Bisping fought with raw emotion, letting anger fuel him. But after the injury, he knew that approach wouldn't work anymore. I always thought being angry made me a better fighter, but really I needed to be cool, calm, and present in the moment. Behind the scenes, Bisping was still fighting personal battles. Depression and self-doubt crept in, but one person helped him through it all: his wife Rebecca. She never helped me, she just loved me, and because of her, I wanted to do better in life. Rebecca was his anchor, a constant source of support. With her by his side, Bisping found the strength to push through every obstacle. Even Joe Rogan, a man who's seen it all in MMA, couldn't help but marvel at Bisping's ability to adapt and succeed after his injury. Bisping fought his last 10 fights with impaired vision, Rogan said, praising Bisping's strategic use of his powerful left hook. Fighting with one eye in a sport that demands precision and awareness sounds impossible, but Bisping didn't just survive, he thrived. Filled with pure willpower, through every setback, Bisping refused to quit. He found a way to adjust, evolve, and keep fighting no matter what. Against all odds, Michael Bisping clawed his way back to the top of the middleweight division. His run was nothing short of remarkable. It all started with his victory over Anderson Silva, a closely contested battle where Bisping outpointed one of the greatest counter-strikers in MMA history. It was a massive win that reminded the world what Bisping was capable of, but the best was yet to come. In 2016, Bisping got got the call of a lifetime, a short-notice title shot against Luke Rockhold. The odds were stacked against him. Rockhold had already beaten Bisping once and was riding high as champion. No one gave Bisping a chance. He had just 2 weeks to prepare, and most thought this was a mismatch. But if there's one thing Bisping had learned over his career, it was how to thrive as the underdog. I've waited my entire life for this. There's no way I'm letting this slip. At UFC 199, Bisping shocked the world. In the first round, he caught Rockhold with a crushing left hook, followed by a series of strikes that ended the fight.
Michael Bisping! That's it! It's the new UFC Middleweight Champion of the world!
It was one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. The underdog had become the champion. It was a storybook ending for a man who refused to give up, even when the world told him not to. Bisping had become the first British UFC champion, making history in the most dramatic way possible. Winning the middleweight title was epic, but staying champion was a different kind of battle. The division was stacked with dangerous contenders, and Bisping's first defense came with serious stakes and a chance at redemption. His opponent, Dan Henderson, the same man who had knocked him out cold at UFC 100. The fight was personal. For Bisping, it wasn't just about defending his title, it was about erasing the ghost of UFC 100. Henderson, even at 46, wasn't going down without a fight. What followed was a brutal 5-round war at UFC 204, with both men trading heavy shots. Bisping's face was battered and swollen by the end, but he never stopped pressing forward. When the dust settled, Bisping emerged victorious, winning a hard-fought decision and finally avenging one of the toughest losses of his career. He later said, "It wasn't pretty, but I got the job done." Being a UFC champion brought new challenges. Bisping was in the spotlight like never before, but years of wear and tear and fighting with impaired vision were starting to catch up with him. In 2017, Bisping was booked to face Georges St. Pierre at UFC 217. GSP, the former welterweight king, was returning after a 4-year hiatus to challenge Bisping for the middleweight title. It was one of the biggest fights in UFC history. Fans were split. Could Bisping defend his title against one of the most well-rounded fighters of all time? Or would St. Pierre's greatness shine through once again? In typical Bisping fashion, he refused to back down. He traded blows with GSP for 3 hard-fought rounds, showing his trademark grit. But in the 3rd round, St. Pierre caught him with a brutal left hook, followed by a takedown and a series of vicious elbows. Moments later, Bisping was caught in a rear naked choke and forced to tap.
Georges St. Pierre has done it! He is the new UFC Middleweight Champion!
It was the end of his reign. There was no shame in losing to a legend like GSP, but for Bisping, it felt like a fitting way to close his title chapter, fighting one of the best to ever do it on the sport's biggest stage. Shortly after his loss to GSP, Bisping stepped into the octagon one last time against Kelvin Gastelum. The fight ended in a quick knockout loss, signaling that it was time for Bisping to walk away from the sport. In 2018, Bisping announced his retirement, citing the toll his career had taken on his body, especially his eye injury. "I can't do this to my family anymore. I can't do it to myself. My eye is in terrible shape." Though his fighting days were over, Bisping's legacy was already secure. In 2019, he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, cementing his place among the greatest fighters in the company's history. His journey from a tough British kid to UFC champion is beyond inspiring. Bisping wasn't the most naturally gifted fighter. He didn't have the flashiest style, but what he did have was an unbreakable will, and that's what made him a legend. After his fight with GSP, Bisping knew it was time to walk away. His body had endured years of punishment, and the risks of continuing were simply too high. It wasn't an easy decision. Fighting had been his life for over a decade. Retirement felt like stepping into the unknown. For someone who thrived on the adrenaline of fight nights and the roar of the crowd, life after fighting felt like a new battle entirely. He talked about this, saying, "When you've been a fighter your whole life, it's hard to adjust. You miss the buzz of fight night, the crowd, the competition." But true to form, Bisping found a way to adapt. He threw himself into new challenges, reinventing himself outside the cage. In recent years, Bisping has opened up about the emotional toll of his career and the struggles he faced after retiring. He speaks candidly about dealing with dark times, depression, and the moments of self-doubt. "I've been through it. The highs, the lows, the doubts, the fear. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can always find a way to keep going. You've just gotta push through through the tough times. Following his retirement, Bisping made a seamless transition into the media world. With his natural charisma, quick wit, and deep knowledge of MMA, he quickly became a fan-favorite commentator and analyst. His ability to break down fights with insights from his own experience in the octagon added a unique touch to every broadcast, because after all, who better to analyze the sport than someone who's fought and won on the biggest stage? In 2019, the UFC recognized his value, offering him a 4-year contract extension as a color commentator. Bisping's voice became a permanent fixture on broadcasts. One of the highlights of Bisping's media career has been his podcast, where his unfiltered humor and candid stories offer fans a deeper glimpse into his life and career. The early episodes, featuring his undeniable chemistry with his co-host, became instant fan favorites. Live shows across the UK and Ireland allowed Bisping to connect with his audience, sharing laughs, stories, and behind-the-scenes moments from his fighting days. Bisping didn't stop at commentary and podcasting. He also stepped into acting. He landed roles in TV shows and movies. Acting, much like fighting, gave Bisping a new challenge and a fresh way to stay in the spotlight. He joked that acting was a lot less painful than fighting, but he approached it with the same work ethic and intensity that made him a champion. Despite his busy schedule, Bisping has always emphasized the importance of family. In his interviews, he frequently mentions that his ultimate goal is to provide for his family and ensure their future. The goal is always the same. It's never ego-driven, it's just about taking care of my family. I want to go to my grave knowing I've set my children up for life. It's that mindset, the same one that carried him through his darkest days, that continues to drive him today. Bisping's journey from a small-town kid in Clitheroe, England to UFC champion and media star is proof that you can reinvent yourself no matter what life throws at you. His reflections on his career highlight the lessons he's learned, pushing through adversity and finding new ways to grow. Dana White once called Bisping's career worthy of a documentary, and he was right. And through it all, Bisping has remained the same, tough, determined, and always willing to share a laugh. His impact on the UFC goes beyond his record in the octagon. As the first British UFC Middleweight Champion, he played a crucial role in bringing mixed martial arts into the mainstream across the UK and Europe. When Bisping entered the UFC, the sport was still largely dominated by American and Brazilian fighters. European fighters rarely got the same level of recognition, and for many, breaking into the UFC seemed like a pipe dream. Bisping changed that. His rise wasn't just personal, it helped legitimize European fighters, proving that they could compete and excel at the highest level. His landmark win over Anderson Silva in 2016 showed the world that Bisping wasn't just a contender, he was a true elite fighter. But his shock knockout over Luke Rockhold to claim the middleweight title, that was the moment everything changed. The underdog had become the champion. Bisping's success opened doors for countless fighters from the UK. Before him, there were no British UFC champions. After him, fighters like Leon Edwards and Tom Aspinall followed in his footsteps, building on the foundation he laid and proving that British fighters belonged on the world stage. Even today, British fighters cite Bisping's refusal to give up as a blueprint. Bisping didn't just connect with fans because of his wins, he connected with them because of his personality. He was sharp-witted, brutally honest, and always ready with a bit of trash talk to fire up his opponents. His willingness to speak his mind made him must-see TV, both inside and outside the octagon. The story of how he continued fighting and eventually became a champion after losing sight in one eye is one of the most inspiring in UFC history. Today, Bisping is remembered as one of the toughest fighters the sport has ever seen. He didn't have the flashiest style, he wasn't the most physically gifted fighter, but what he did have was an unbreakable will, and that's what made him great. Speaking of unbreakable will, another former UFC fighter who has undergone a tremendous amount of setbacks in his life is Francis Ngannou. From crossing the Sahara Desert to multiple failed attempts of reaching Europe, his story is just as worthy of a movie as Bisping's. Fortunately for you, we've covered it, and you can watch it right now. See you there.